I'll just put my hello. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar, special Keep Space for Peace webinar by the Global Network, hosted by Yorkshire CND. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you're all keeping safe and well. So this is the second Global Network webinar on campaigning on space issues. This one's entitled Space Domination and has been arranged to take place during Keep Space for Peace Week. I'm just going to put some slides on here. And I'll have to share the screen. Sorry, now I've lost it. I've lost the screen, so I have to come back there. Really well. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see a bird.
That's the Global Network symbol. So this is what we're on today, space domination. So in 1999, the United Nations General Assembly declared that World Space Week should be held from the 4th to the 10th of October each year, or for the first week of October each year. And in this period, the Global Network has called for global actions and events during the week to keep space for peace. Today, we'll be discussing the rapidly increasing militarization and weaponization of space. An increasing number of news reports have appeared accusing either Russia or China of doing something terrible in space, firing weapons off or seeking to dominate the region. However, the US Space Command and its successors have been talking about working towards space domination since 1997, when it published its Vision for 2020, which recognized that so important are space systems to military operations that it's unrealistic to imagine that they will never become targets. It also recognized and accepted the growing division between the global economic haves and have-nots, and introduced the doctrine of full spectrum dominance, the military domination of land, sea, air, space, and information to protect the interests of the haves. So what is really happening, and what can we do to ensure that the spirit of 1967 Outer Space Treaty, that space should be considered as a global commons to be used for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development. The Outer Space Treaty was initiated by Russia, the US, and the UK, and has 110 state parties, but it looks destined to be yet another treaty that's being ignored and even discarded. So let me just introduce the panel. This is me. I must admit it was a couple of years ago, but that's me, Dave Webb. I'm the convener of the Global Network. We have Karl Grossman, who's one of the original co-founders of the Global Network and a GN and the Global Network board member. And he's written and produced information videos on space militarization. Tamara Lawrence from Canada is a Global Network board member, an activist, and a PhD candidate in global governance. She's also a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Then we have Sung-Hee Choi from South Korea, who's also a Global Network board member and an artist and art teacher who's worked on the causes of the division of Korea since 2000. She has been particularly active against the construction of the huge military naval base at Gangjong Village on Jeju Island. Then we have Denis Doherty from Australia, who's well known for his long-term commitment to peace and to ridding the world of nuclear weapons. He was a founding member of the Australian Anti-Bases Campaign Coalition and has been the national coordinator of the campaign for over 20 years. And then we have Bruce Gagnon, from the US, who's also the secretary and coordinator of the global network. He's been working on space issues for the past 30 years and helped create the global network in 1992. He's trained as an organizer by the United Farm Workers Union and is also a member of Veterans for Peace. So they will all talk for about 10 minutes each or so, and giving their particular viewpoints on the issues and how we confront this terrible militarization of space. And then it will be over to you for comments and questions. The total time should be about 1.5 hours. So if you're joining us on Zoom, you can submit your comments and questions through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this live on Facebook, then just add a comment on the Facebook page. Let me give you a brief introduction first and set the scene for the rest of the webinar. And I want to give a kind of European, well, mainly UK viewpoint on what's happening too. So Donald Trump authorized the US Space Force at the end of last year. At the time, he said that it marked a big moment and that there was going to be a lot of things happening in space because space is the world's newest warfighting domain. US Secretary of Defense Mark Esper was quoted as saying that outer space has evolved into a warfighting domain. Maintaining American dominance in that domain is now the mission of the United States Space Force. Other nations are, of course, also joining in. Russia, China, and India have extensive military space programs already for some time. But last July, President Macron declared that France had allocated 3.6 billion euros to its own military space force to take warfighting into space. And the following week in the UK, the Penny Mordaunt, the UK Defence Secretary at the time, she's no longer Defence Secretary, outlined a new multi-million space program for the Ministry of Defence involving the development of small satellites. Mordaunt also announced that today we show the sky is no longer the limit for our armed forces, and that Joint Forces Command will become Strategic Command and will coordinate the warfighting domains of air, land, sea, cyber, and space. She also talked of facing up to evolving threats and of being the first partner in Operation Olympic Defender, the US-led international coalition aimed at deterring so-called hostile actions by rivals. A memorandum of understanding has also been signed now between small satellite specialist Surrey Satellite Technology Limited and a new RAF team named Artemis to establish a small satellite communications constellation to act as a data link relay to the cockpits of fighter jets, giving them a complete picture for pilot tactical awareness. The UK government has also awarded grants totaling £40 million to establish the launch of small satellites from UK spaceports. Spaceports in Cardiff, Cornwall, and Scotland are planned. 2 are planned in Scotland for Sutherland and the Shetlands, and they have been marketed as commercial developments for launching climate and communication satellites. However, US aerospace giant Lockheed Martin has received £23.5 million to help with spaceport development, and other defence contractors such as Raytheon and BAE Systems are involved also. More than a strong indication that there will be military applications here. There are of course a lot of individuals and groups around the world who are resisting these activities, people who want to keep space for peace. And here's a just general quickly overview of where those protests and what those protests are about are occurring around the world. Many of these groups are part of the global network. Some are not, but are well aware of our work too. So against all aspects of the militarization of space, including the contractors, the bases, the military bases, and so on. There's a lot happening. And we're trying to get these ideas out through conferences, through meetings, and we're working continually for peace in space and of course on Earth. So now let's go over to the panel and to discuss different ideas and ways of confronting this huge problem of the militarization and corporatization of space. So first of all, we have Karl Grossman from the United States. Professor Grossman is a well-known author and maker of videos on this particular issue. So thanks, Karl, over to you.
A pleasure to be on this webinar. Let me start by saying, just in terms of historical context, it didn't start with Vision for 2020, the effort by the United States to make space a new arena of war. It didn't begin with Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program of the 1980s. It actually goes back to after World War II, when the United States, through what was called the Project Paperclip, brought over 1,000 former Nazi scientists to develop a US space program. You know the name of Werner von Braun, and there was hundreds of others. And in fact, one of the first things that was done was these Nazis were involved in the creation of the V1, the V for Vengeance rocket, and the V2 rocket. And they worked with the United States military in developing the Redstone rocket. Redstone because they were based at the Redstone Army Arsenal in Alabama, and it was the first US rocket capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. And then we move on again, the Star Wars scheme of Reagan and the vision for 2020. This has been percolating for a long time, but now we're at a critical point, an absolutely critical point. I mean, this person that's in the White House in the United States who has orange hair, as he declared when he signed the papers establishing a US Space Force in December of last year, it's not enough to have American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space, American dominance in space. And also, and this is so concerning, this concept of, again, this push to turn the heavens into a war zone is being joined into by, David just mentions the French. The British are moving ahead with the Royal Space Force. In Japan, they've developed the Japanese Space Defense. They like to use the word as we do in the United States, defense, rather than war unit. Well, there's just a few more than 20 days before the election in the United States. It looks likely, and we can all hope and pray and work, that the orange person is defeated and he allows the will of the people to stand and he leaves office. However, to have an expectation that the Democrats are going to come to our rescue might be false thinking. For example, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2020, and in it was the provision that a US Space Force be established as a new sixth branch of US Armed Forces, was voted in the House of Representatives in the United States. 189 Republicans, 188 Democrats voted for it. 6 Republican House members voted no, 41 Democrats, 1 independent voted no. And in the Senate, it was actually even worse proportionally. It was a vote of 86-8. Some 48 Republicans, 37 Democrats voted for it. 4 Republicans, just 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats voted no. Now, the global network has been the world leader in challenging this push to militarize, to weaponize to nuclearize. And there's a very intimate connection between weapons in space and nukes in space, nuclear power in space. And if the Democrats win in the United States, don't take in terms of the presidency and the Senate, hopefully, and the House of Representatives, again, don't, take a breath of relief. There's great work that has to be done. Now, I think it might be, I'm sure it might be work that we could be more successful at than trying to deal with Reagan and his scoundrels and those in the U.S. military who want to extend war into space. But it's going to be a very, very hard struggle, a hard fight, as it's been through the years. And the other new thing in my country, which is important, is what David just mentioned, the corporatization of space activities. I mean, at this point, the US space establishment, military establishment, is working hand in hand, for example, working with Elon Musk and his SpaceX company, and also Jeff Bezos. So what's been inserted into this equation is money, which is at the bottom of what usually determines what the United States is about, money. And so here you got the profit motive working to turn the heavens into a war zone. Now, finally, let me stress the vision of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The notion was, and Dave just mentioned it, that space should be a global domain for peaceful purposes, not for war. And I've interviewed both for print and for the internet and for my videos on this, Craig Eisendrath. And he was a young State Department officer involved in the putting together with the United Kingdom and the former Soviet Union of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which has now been signed on to by much of the nations of the world. It forbids weapons of mass destruction, importantly, in space. An extension of the Outer Space Treaty has been crusaded for by Canada, our neighbor Canada, which cannot be considered a threat, an enemy to the United States, Russia, and China. And this is called the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And the Paros Treaty, acronym Paros Treaty, would bar all weapons in space, and indeed keep space for peace. But the way it works at the United Nations is, the US has been able to use the system at the UN and the way the votes are held at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva to essentially veto the Paros Treaty. And that's so telling. I mean, here the US is involved in this baloney that we got to move into space with weapons. We have to militarize space because China and Russia are doing so. That isn't happening. I mean, just again, point to the Paros Treaty and the efforts by China and Russia. And I've been to both countries. I've spoken to their diplomats. They do not want to go through the enormous expense of developing space as the war zone. And just let me finally end, and it's so important, the link with nuclear. The kind of weapons that the US has been interested in deploying in space are hypervelocity guns, particle beams, and laser weapons, all of which it's working on now and has for years with enormous energy. And speaking of energy, those weapons need high energy. And the plan for Star Wars, and ultimately, if God forbid, this person with the orange hair is reelected and the space push continues, or the Democrats fold and the space push continues, there's going to have to be a deployment of weapons in space. as James Christensen, who was in charge of it was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars was the nickname, said way back then, without reactors in office, we'd have battle platforms with reactors and super plutonium systems. That was the architecture of Star Wars. Without these nuclear systems in orbit, we're going to need a long extension cord back down to Earth, bringing up power. So the relationship between nuclear in space and weapons in space is absolutely intimate. And let me, if I can grab it quick, and there's a bunch of papers that are in front of me. And this is just a couple of days old, and I'm not finding it, but it's a news piece about the US developing a nuclear rocket for military purposes. So we're in deep stuff, and we have to do what the global network has done ever since its formation. We have to keep fighting.
Thank you very much, Karl. Thank you. Unless there are any immediate questions to Karl, we'll move on. We can collect questions as we go along, and we will have a session at the end where you can pose your questions, and we'll answer those if we can. So our next speaker is Tamara Lawrence from Canada, who's a Global Network board member and a very powerful and energetic activist. Tamara, over to you.
Good morning, everyone from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. I'm going to share my slides with you. Hopefully this works okay. Can everyone hear and see me all right? Okay, great. So it's nice to be with you all to mark the International Keep Space for Peace Week. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. This week, I've been thinking about Indigenous cosmological views. For the Indigenous people of the land that is now Canada, the heavens are and have always been an important way to guide their life. For the Anishinaabe people, there is a spiritual connection between the earth and the star world. And in the stars, they see their ancestors. And when the stars, like the aurora borealis, are moving across the sky, they see their ancestors dancing. They have their own star stories. They have their own names for the constellations. Like for the Big Dipper, they call it the fish stars. They have an oral tradition where they share and pass on their star stories. So there are different ways of understanding the heavens. That we need to consider and respect. But, I'm very troubled that over the past 2 years, the United States and NATO have launched, a dangerous new story of the stars. Last August, when President Trump launched the new military command, the new military space command, he said that space will be a new war-fighting domain, and NATO is perpetuating this dangerous star story. So this is NATO's tweet for this week. For Space Week, it was posted on Tuesday, and you can see here that NATO has recognized space as a new operational demand. Today, I'd like to focus my remarks on NATO and space and how vital it is that we resist NATO. NATO, of course, is an aggressive nuclear-armed military alliance. It's an alliance to maintain Western domination. It's comprised of 30 countries, including Canada. It is dominated and dictated by the United States. NATO also has this Partnership for Peace program, so-called, that includes countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Afghanistan, and Colombia. Colombia is the first Latin American partner. But Colombia is a narco state. It's governed by the right-wing government of Ivan Duque that has connections to drug trafficking that's undermining the 2016 peace deal. It is also one of the most violent countries in South America, a country where journalists are threatened and attacked, and where human rights defenders are killed. Last year, 300 human rights defenders and social movement leaders were killed, and this year so far, already 100 have been killed. So Colombia is, of course, a US ally, very close, and it is increasing tension and conflict with its neighbor, Venezuela. So this is a country that NATO is partnering with. It's as the Transatlantic Alliance moves into Latin America. So just as it is nefarious that NATO is expanding into Latin America, it is equally nefarious that NATO is expanding into space as it is. So at the 2018 NATO summit in Brussels, alliance leaders stated that that space is essential for the alliance's security, and they agreed to develop a new NATO space policy. Then last summer, in June of 2019, the NATO defense ministers adopted a new space policy. And until that point, NATO didn't have a specific space mandate or policy. 6 months later, of course, at the Leaders Summit in London, the NATO leaders declared space a fifth operational domain alongside air, land, sea, and cyberspace. And at that time, the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, stated, "We have declared space an operational domain, recognizing its importance in keeping us safe, tackling security challenges while upholding international law." He also said that NATO has no intention to put weapons in space. Yet the space policy is not publicly available. I contacted NATO to ask for a copy of it, and they replied that it's classified. But we can only speculate what NATO's plans are for space based on its aggressive operations on Earth and its destabilizing expansion in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. There are 2,000 satellites currently orbiting the Earth, and around half of them are owned by NATO members. And it's very much to preserve Western domination. As Karl said, NATO operates its own SATCOM satellite communications program. Some of the satellites are defunct and are still orbiting Earth, and they're carrying the NATO flag. Last year, NATO authorized €1 billion for a new SATCOM service that's going to last over the next 15 years. So there's an increased push for space now by NATO. A lot of money is going into it. NATO relies on national space capabilities, predominantly from the US and the UK, to provide data and services such as imagery, navigation, and early warning. And these space capabilities facilitate NATO's war making and its wars. China and Russia are the only peer competitors to NATO in space, and we know that NATO is dangerously provoking Russia and China on Earth. So war in space against Russia or China, nuclear powers, would be disastrous and would risk an all-out nuclear war. Russia and China don't want space used as a domain of war. At the United Nations Conference on Disarmament, Russia and China have regularly put forward their draft treaty on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. So they've done so in 2008, in 2014, and in 2018. However, Western countries are reluctant and opposed to this initiative. And so this Sino-Russia draft treaty to prevent an arms race in space has not moved forward as it should. I just want to quickly mention that France, a NATO member, announced its own Space Force and defense policy. And earlier this year, Macron proposed that NATO establish a new center of excellence for space in Toulouse. And this is where France's Space Command, Space Operations Center, and Civilian Space Hub are all based. And I think that it's incumbent on the global network to follow this French connection and to reach out and find French allies for peace in space. So just as war on Earth is good for business, for the merchants of death, it's good for their bottom lines. For the weapon manufacturers, conflict in space is also good for their business. 2 years ago, it was reported that the US military was not keen on US Space Force. Many military officials thought it was too costly and it would be redundant. Yet congressmen, backed by defense contractors, pushed for a new separate space command in the National Defense Authorization Act in 2018. And then in 2019, when Mark Esper became the US Secretary of Defense, he also pushed really hard for this new US Space Force. And Esper, of course, it was the top lobbyist for Raytheon, and Raytheon manufactures space and airborne sensor systems that are used by the US military. Last year in Canada, the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, they applauded Trump's announcement for Space Force, and this was reported in our media here. And the CDA said that US Space Force was a good idea and that Canada should copy it. But it's no surprise that this Canadian industry association is funded by the big US weapons manufacturers, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and L3Harris. And so, of course, they're very supportive of US Space Force. Tension, conflict, competition, war in space are all good for their bottom lines and their excessive executive compensation. I would quickly like to bring to your attention that in June of this year, the NATO Secretary General announced a new campaign for the alliance called #NATO30. This is a dangerous project to expand the alliance geographically, militarily, and politically. This accompanies NATO's public relations campaign, We Are NATO, #WeAreNato, that was launched 2 years ago. If you follow NATO on social media, you will see this everywhere, and I really want to urge us all to resist this. I want you to use the counter hashtags, #WeAreNotNato and No to NATO 2030. Finally, I want to share with you how we in Canada are resisting NATO. Last year, for NATO's 70th anniversary, I organized monthly demonstrations outside the NATO Association of Canada office. The organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we have a campaign, Feminists Against Militarism, Women Say No to NATO, and we have all of our signs, and we protest monthly outside of the NATO Association of Canada office and at all of their events when they take place here in Toronto. I'll just show you a few slides because I'm very proud of our efforts here. Aren't they awesome sign? No to war, no to NATO, Canada out of NATO. So we want Canada out of NATO, and we want the alliance abolished. We are also very opposed to NATO's 2% target. As many of you know, at the Wales Summit in 2014, NATO members agreed to increase their defense budgets by 2% by 2024. And Trump recently patted himself on the back, saying that in the past 3 years, because of his pressure, NATO members have increased their military spending by $100 billion. Now just think for a moment, if we had been spending that $100 billion over the past 3 years into healthcare and into the climate emergency, we would not be in the state that we're in right now. So, you know, at this time when funding is needed for the global health crisis and the climate emergency, and to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, NATO countries are irresponsibly increasing their military spending. I think that you know, NATO is a threat to global public health and to the climate. I wrote, I'll just show you a couple of more pictures. I wrote this article that I'd be happy to share with you if you send me an email, that NATO, I think, is one of the greatest threats to the climate. And I can explain that more in the question and answer. But I want to end by thinking about some peaceful alternatives to NATO. Of course, there's international institutions and international law and diplomacy, institutions like the United Nations and regional bodies like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So it makes the alliance totally unnecessary. We have to push for global cooperation and peace in space. This is possible. This is possible with these institutions and with international law. I also want us to think for a moment about the International Space Station, you know, the research laboratory that orbits the Earth. The United States, Canada, Europe, Japan and Russia have been working together on the International Space Station for 40 years, and astronauts from countries like South Africa, Brazil, Netherlands, Malaysia, they have all been welcomed on to the International Space Station. But the country that is not welcome, that is barred from the International Space Station is China. And that's because in 2011, the US Congress, under the Obama administration, passed a resolution prohibiting any American contact with the Chinese in space. And so this is something that we absolutely have to resist and to change. I believe that we need to create an international movement to resist NATO, and I'm very proud that the global network is part of that resistance. And finally, I would like to invite you all to Ottawa, Canada's capital, next June. We're having a huge peace conference. It's called Divest, Disarm, and Demilitarize. We're going to have a fantastic conference. We're also going to have a global network meeting. This is, of course, hoping that the global pandemic subsides by then and we're allowed to see each other in person. And this big peace conference is also timed with a big protest of CANSEC. This is the largest arms fair in North America. So I'm so happy to connect with you all virtually, and I'm hoping that I will see you all next year in Canada, and we can work towards peace in space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Just before we go on to the next speaker, there are a couple of questions, Q&As coming up now. I think we'll keep those till the end of the speakers, and then we'll come back to those. So there's one from Prajwal Dahal, who has indicated he wants to say something, and Karl Grossman has already said he will answer the question from Prabhu Yadav from Nepal. So that will come up at the end of the speakers. So thank you for Tamara, and let's move on now to Sung-Hee Choi from South Korea, who's been an amazing activist in Jeju Island to prevent the militarization of that particular small island in South Korea. Over to you, Sung-Hee. I think you're muted. Can't hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, I am Sung-Hee Choi from Gangjang Village, Jeju, Korea. Thank you for having me. My talk is on the US-led Asia-Pacific missile defense, focused more on the Northeast Asia MD and more on Korea. First, the United States Indo-Pacific Command. For the United States, the US Indo-Pacific Command is the command in charge of the area. Around 50% of world population live here. It is the critical area for the US imperial strategy to dominate over the world through intensifying military tension. North Korea, along with Iran, is told to cause United States missile defense. However, the ultimate aim of the United States is to contain China and Russia. And it is through, I emphasize, first, US-led alliance/partnership. Second, missile defense system, which is more precisely militarization of space, such as Space Force. In the area, the United States plan for Quad alliance and Quad plus by partnership countries, which could work as Asia version NATO. The Quad indicates 4 countries: the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. Second, the missile defense belt in Japan and Korea. The role of the United States and Japan in forming alliances in the area should not be ignored. It is important to understand how the United States, South Korea, Japan alliance is centered with the missile defense system. First, there are United States bases in the region. In South Korea, Pyeongtaek, Kunsan, and Busan are where the United States Forces, Korea Army, Navy, and Air Force headquarters are located. And the US bases there form missile defense belt along with the Jeju Navy base. And in Japan, beside the two main radar bases in Shariki and Kyogamisaki, Yokota, Jama, Yokohama, Sasebo, mainland of Japan, and Kadena and Futenma and White Beach in Okinawa are where main US bases of Japan locate. The 7 United States Forces of Japan bases are rear base of UN Command headquartered in Pyeongtaek in South Korea. Third, this is one of the most important part. Let me see. Okay. This one first. The islands are militarized with US base and non-US bases. It is meaningless to distinguish between US bases and non-US bases. Look at the location of Jeju Navy base, a South Korea base built in 2016, a strategic spot for the US against China. The Jeju Second Airport, which would be an Air Force base, is planned. Look at the islands of Amamio, Miyako, Ishigaki, and Yonaguni in the Okinawa archipelago, where Japanese military radar missile bases are being built against China. The islands and their seas of the area suffer from arms race. Guam, Hawaii, Marshall Islands suffer, forced either to be US missile defense regional headquarters, outpost, or test sites. Why the removal of a third terminal high altitude area defense in Soseongni is a key for peace of Northeast Asia. This is a very important part. Mr. Go Young-dae, Solidarity for Peace and Unification of Korea emphasizes the missile defense is the center of a US-led alliance, thus the center of US global domination. He also emphasizes that withdrawal of the US terminal high altitude area defense third system forcefully built in Seongju, South Korea 2017 is the key for bringing peace for Northeast Asia. Why? It's because of the radar close to China and Russia. The third system is useless in small Korean peninsula. However, its radar can see most military bases in the heart of China and delivers information to the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii and also Strategic Command in Nebraska in the United States. So the third system in Seongju is not the mere weapon. It is a leverage to dismantle the balance of power in the region. That's why it is dangerous. And recently, the third system is upgraded for the term called Joint Operational Emergent Need, acronym JEON. And this is under the US Indo-Pacific Command. So let me talk about the Space Force and also the military vision for aerospace. It was 2008 when the South Korean Air Force first chose Special Human Force for Space as the first stage to realize the leap for Space Force. Its satellite monitoring and control squadron is planned to be war-powered this October. And it was the beginning of this year that the Army and Navy also respectively organized either the Missile Space Policy Team and Battle System / Space Policy Development Department. It was 2018 that the South Korean Ministry of National Defense installed the Missile Space Department, while first Global Hawk arrived last December. South Korea's first military satellite was launched this July. And how about Japan? Japan established her own Space Force squadron in May this year, namely protecting for countries' satellites. It's my last slide. Despite all those green pictures, it is always important to remember that there are many people on the planet who are resisting such arms race and militarization of our lands, seas, and skies. This year, people in Japan succeeded to dissipate the plan of Aegis Ashore system, one of missile defense system. How we can stop the missile defense? How we can stop the militarization of space? One of the things you can do is to sign the petition called End the Korean War. The military and arms company are fed by military tension, conflict, and war. They'll find all the excuse to have a missile defense system through them in this era of a climate crisis and pandemic. Peace of space is for peace of earth. Let's keep space for peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sung-Hee. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can you unshare the screen?
Oh, yes, sure. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We'll move on again, I think, to Denis Doherty from Australia and the anti-bases campaign there. Denis, over to you.
Okay. Okay. So thanks very much, everyone. The US bases in Australia have been here for a while, and they have stayed here, and they're very difficult to move because the ruling elites of Australia feel that if they are on the side of the United States, they're on the side of success, and so that they have promoted and sustained the US bases here in Australia. This quote here is from a member of our anti-bases coalition who's written a book about the US lobby in Australia, and I just put that up to show how difficult it is for civil societies in countries like Australia, how difficult it is to push and move the government on US bases. Not that we have any intention of giving up. The other thing that's happened quite strangely for us is that a very conservative Prime Minister who actually got Australia into the Vietnam War, Malcolm Fraser, had a change of heart, and he and for the timely establishment of a truly independent Australia. And that, coming from Malcolm Fraser, was an amazing event for many of us in Australia, although it had little effect on the party that he came from, which strangely enough is called the Liberal Party, but there's anything but liberal. So when you read the consensus in Australia about when people write about the US alliance, about US bases, there is this feeling that the US will save us. And the other feeling is that, well, what we've said previously was the elite and the very wealthy want to be on the winning side in any confrontation. And so we have bipartisan agreement between both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party to keep Australia's alliance with the United States. Australia is willing to do almost anything to keep the US involved down here. Sorry, I went too fast. And this is an old cartoon from the 80s, and it was a prime minister from the 80s. But this is the attitude of Australian prime ministers, to kiss the hem of the garment of the United States, and it's a very difficult task to shake that feeling in Australia that we should be an independent. That we should get out of the US-Australian alliance, and this slide just goes over some of the history and of the Australian-US alliance, and that for a long time after the World War II, the United States was more interested in Europe than it was in Australia, and it took them quite a while to get interested in Australia. But they started in the 60s, and they created two bases, one at a place called Northwest Cape and the other one at Pine Gap. And ever since that time, every prime minister from the 1950s and 60s has added more US facilities. So we have something like 50 US bases in Australia now. This map of Australia and the US bases shows that there's a very strong emphasis down the centre of Australia for bases of various types. And then there's also a strong emphasis on the west coast, looking at the Indian Ocean. And then there's smaller bases along the east coast. And when you see a bigger map, you'll understand what the reason for that is. So we have in Australia all the different sorts of bases, ones that gather intelligence, ones that target, have targeting information, drone attacks, missile defense, and so on. So we have all those sorts of bases. And the reasons why Australia is particularly good for the United States is that these bases give a good strategic position between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And so they don't talk about the Pacific, they talk about the Indo-Pacific. And that Australia does provide cheap facilities with several climate types to exercise in. We have tropical, temperate and savanna areas. So the United States military get an opportunity to exercise in these areas, all for no expense, all for no money, just the expense of paying for their own troops. And they also get a controlling influence on the country. And there's quite a strong feeling that if we had a government that wanted to get rid of the alliance, it would very quickly suffer a coup, as did the Whitlam government in the 70s. So that's the situation in Australia with bases. And that was the map I was telling you about, how you see Australia is on the side between the Pacific and the Indian. And we have in Australia at the moment an incredible campaign of hatred of China. And every day we get a news release about what terrible things they've done in the South China Sea. But they never mention any of those bases. These are the brand new bases they've built. And the Sung-Hee Choi from South Korea had a lot more to say about what's happening in Japan and Korea. But we never hear anything about that. We only ever hear about China. There was a news item this morning where there's a push from Australian parliamentarians, I think it was started in Europe, to boycott the Chinese Winter Olympics. So, and then there's Australia's reasons for keeping the bases. They feel, you know, a lot of people feel we're under threat from large numbers of people in very highly populated areas to the north, and all those sort of usual sorts of reasons that you'll hear from politicians. But they've come into the popular culture, and this is the sort of thing we struggle against. And there's been a development in the campaign against US bases here. The anti-bases campaign is still going, but when the troops came into Darwin, there was an added push for people to get behind another campaign, which is called IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia. So we work together, and we work on very similar campaigns, and we support each other on these issues. Just going back in history a bit, when we were at a base in South Australia, some of the protesters got inside the base, and the Prime Minister at the time sent troops to guard the base. And one of the local cartoonists put that cartoon about you know, what had happened at the base, and it was incredibly embarrassing for the Australian government that that people had actually gone into the base, although nothing was hurt, or there was no damage done, but the reaction was just amazing. So we've been going for quite a few years, trying to get a demonstration at a base every 2 years, and we've keeping that going. And then the challenge now is that there was a time when the government was trying to be even-handed between China and the US, but now the government has come down squarely in favour of the US and created a climate of fear of China. We need to develop a broad consensus that the US alliance and the bases does more harm than good. Sorry about that. We've asked this sort of question in, you know, are we really Australian, or are we just another state of the United States? This is the gates of Pine Gap, where we were there in 2016. Now, to give you a sense of for the next slide, that gate is 7 kilometres from the actual base, 7 kilometres. You cannot see it from any part of Alice Springs, from the local area, unless you climb up small mountains and peer over the top of these mountains. You cannot even see the base. When I went to Menwith Hill, you could drive along beside it, and yet here in Australia, you can't even see the base. Then they've even passed a law, like we were breaking the law there. We were not even allowed to be within a kilometre of that gate, but they let that law go past. And, that's another slide. I thought we should mention Edward Snowden, who has done a great service to the sort of work we do. This book has just been released about Pine Gap, and it tells the story of some protesters in 2016 who got into the base, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, they played violins and sang hymns right at the base. That's the picture of the base. They sang. They never got into there's a fence around those bases there, around those radomes. They never got through those fences, but they were looking at 7 years in jail for doing that. And the government was keen to make an example of them. And this is a climate here in Australia about US bases. And so that book is now on the market, and it's a rather good read. We're launching it in Sydney next Friday. Despite all the problems with the virus, Australia still let the Marines come into Darwin for their annual exercises. And that was a tweet we put out welcoming the US Marines coming to Australia. There's a third base here that is developing called Codgerina, which is an echelon and warfighting base, which is in Western Australia. And it provides Australian access to US funded satellites, and Australia has contributed a sixth satellite. And so that's the space aspect of it. The government has passed a law that the United States can use any Australian military facility it deems necessary, and one of these is a place called Tyndall. And the Australian government has just put aside 1.6 billion in the middle of the virus. They put aside 1.6 billion to upgrade the airport for the sake of the United States and their actions against possible actions against China. This is the north of the country. You see from Darwin across to the west, and offshore there's a series of petroleum areas which are very valuable, so that's where Australia has been putting its military equipment, and that's where US forces have been putting their military as well. So there's so that's where US bases have gone in Australia, as well as the Australian military. That's another shot of Pine Gap. Now, on the other hand, Australia has created a civilian space program, and they have put together a space agency, and they want to, they've put aside several $100 million to have this particular space force. space agency, and we haven't got a space force, but there's a push for the Royal Australian Air Force to have a section for space, and the Australian Defence Force has evolved to such an extent that it claims it would be deaf, dumb and blind if it didn't have access to space, and that they don't want to be totally dependent on the United States. So they want to create their own satellites. And the last point being that Australia has signed up to be involved with an exercise called the Shrivner Space War Exercises. So even when they talk about space and civilians, it seems to be a cover for military operations. And I think that's right. Yeah, that's so. Along with everybody else, I say keep space for peace, and that's our struggle here in Australia. And good luck with all your work over in your own countries. All the best.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks very much. Please remember, people watching, that you can put Q&A questions in. Also, just to say that Will Griffin, who's one of a GN board member too, has made some amazing videos for the GN, the global network, and one of them was on Pine Gap. There's also one he's just made on Jeju Island, on the protests and the movement there, which has just come out. So if you would like to view those, they're on the Facebook, Global Network Facebook, and also there are links on the webpage. And now we'll go over to Bruce. Bruce is the coordinator of the Global Network, and many of you will know of him already. He's an amazing activist and puts space at as the kind of major campaigning issue, I think. So thanks a lot, Bruce. Over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning to everybody, or good evening. In Dennis's case, I guess, good night. Thank you to Yorkshire C&D for setting all this up, and thanks to all the excellent previous presentations. I think by now, after hearing from everybody, it's pretty clear that the US, NATO, the Western corporate interests are out to try to put a loaded gun to the head of Russia and China, who are ascending powers, who are talking about a multipolar world rather than a unipolar world with the US and NATO in charge of the planet. And this is really heading for a collision, like two trains ready to smash into each other. It could lead to the final solution, if you will, the final war to end all wars. And so this is really what we're dealing with here. And now with space technology, it's becoming even more expensive and more dangerous than ever. The Pentagon has long been saying that Star Wars will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And in an editorial some years ago in Space News, they reported that they had come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all of this space technology. And they said it's the entitlement programs that in the United States are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the tattered social safety net. So this is what the industry is pushing for: growing poverty, complete rejection of dealing with climate crisis, while they move to maintain control and domination of the planet on behalf of corporate interests. And as also you've heard, missile defense is a key element. We've heard it over and over again in these presentations. Missile defense is really misnamed. It's an offensive program. It's the shield to be used after a US first strike attack is launched against Russia and China. Again, that loaded gun to the head of Russia and China signifies that the United States today is encircling both those countries with an expanding NATO, as Tamara very clearly laid out, and that the job then is to use missile defense to pick off any retaliatory strikes after a U.S. suicidal first strike attack is launched against Russia and China. That's how close to danger we are. And both Russia and China have been saying for years now, we can't afford to reduce our nuclear retaliatory capability by much, as long as the United States is encircling us with these so-called missile defense systems. Just to illustrate, in Poland and Romania, the United States has now built Aegis Ashore launch facilities. These will be missile defense land-based bases in Poland and Romania. And they will also be able to fire from these launch facilities nuclear-capable Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are first strike weapons that could reach Moscow from Poland and Romania in 10 minutes time. Now, how is Russia to respond to that? It's absolutely dangerous, provocative as hell. The Space Force that's been, I think, fairly well described here already, all I want to add to it is that there's another role. Other than fighting against Russia and China, there's another role, and that is to control the pathway on and off the planet Earth, so that when the rich corporations, people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, they've created these aerospace companies now, and they want to go out and colonize planetary bodies. They want to mine the sky. They want to use nuclear power for nuclear mining colonies. And as Karl said earlier, they want to have a nuclear rocket with nuclear reactors for engines in order to get to Mars. Well, they want to also control who gets on and off the planet Earth, which country is allowed to go out and mine the sky in the future. And this is one of the roles I would submit to you that the Space Force would be taking on, is essentially creating a military gate on and off the planet Earth. Talk about that 7-mile gate to get to be able to see Pine Gap. This would be a gate that would keep you from getting on and off the planet Earth to get out into deep space in the future. So this is, I think, the ultimate reality of this slogan that has long been over the doorway at the U.S. Space Command, or the Air Force Space Command headquarters in Colorado Springs, master of space. These people are serious about this idea and about this idea of domination. So how do we really deal with it? How do we stop this madness? Well, of course, doing all of our collective work around the world in our various countries, trying to educate people, trying to get them to see the expense and the dangerous nature of this growing space warfare program. That's one key tactic that we have to continue to do. But I also think the introduction of the conversion, economic conversion argument in all of our work is more important than ever, especially at a time when we have this climate crisis. We know that unless we move money tomorrow, today even, from the Pentagon and from our collective militaries around the world into dealing with climate crisis, we have no future on this planet. Our children and grandchildren have no future. And so we've got to demand this conversion of the military industrial complex around the world to deal with climate change, building tidal power systems, offshore wind turbines, solar power, public transportation, and many other these kind of systems. And here in Bath, where I live in Bath, Maine, I'm 2 blocks from the Bath Iron Works shipyard where they build the Navy Aegis destroyers. We've been running such a campaign for some time. One of our friends is now running, one of our leaders of our movement here in Maine is now running for the US Senate And one of her key issues that she's talking about is conversion of Bath Iron Works. And just today, the famous climate change activist Bill McKibben wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine online today where he endorses Lisa's platform flank on converting Bath Iron Works to help deal with climate change. So this is a breakthrough, because just a couple of years ago, I was invited to introduce McKibben at a big event in Portland, Maine. He was coming in over the internet, and he was Skyping in, and I was asked to comment after his speech, and I asked him about conversion, and he trashed it. So he's now today endorsing the conversion effort, which is a good step forward, because the climate change movement, as I think most of you know, has not been touching the military, not been touching the fact that the Pentagon has the largest carbon footprint on the planet Earth. It's the biggest contributor to climate crisis. And so this is a step forward. We have to continue to lead in this direction as well, make these connections between military and climate. When they're talking about launching thousands and thousands of satellites to put a 5G satellite relay system over every person's head on the planet, do you realize how much ozone depletion there's going to be around the world? So these are the connections that we should be making, tying together this whole space issue with climate as well. Thank you again, everyone, for being a part of it today. We so much appreciate it. I think we're going to be posting this on Facebook and hopefully on YouTube as well, so that we can increase the numbers of people that see this webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you to all the speakers. We have got some questions coming in now. So I'd first of all like to ask Karl if you could tackle Prabhu Yadav's question, which is, he's from Nepal. His query is, how will the world people get a free and peaceful space in the capitalist and military occupied world? For example, the most rich countries are involving in space militarization. A global space for all creatures on Earth should be our aim.
Well, it's an excellent question, that's for sure. And what I would suggest would be a three-part strategy. The first part would be grassroots action. And that's what's turned around things in my country more than anything else. The civil rights movement, I mean, that was won on the streets and in protests and in demonstrations. The Gandhian approach, the approach of Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers. Bruce worked under Cesar Chavez. Grassroots action is so important. And the global network has been in the fore internationally in terms of grassroots action. Then national action. Maybe we can't get the whole world, but I think we have to try to do things right. But often we can get our own country, maybe not often, sometimes we can get our own country to do things right. For example, just a few days before Trump announced this Space Force and signed the documents and so forth, New Zealand took a very important step, and I'm looking here at an article in the New Zealand Herald. Government updates rules of what can be sent into space. The cabinet has agreed to update rules, banning payloads which contribute to nuclear weapons programs or support military operations contrary to government policy. So I think whatever country you're from, some are more malleable in terms of getting to do the right thing, some are not. And then finally, international action. I mean, that's been the vision, that's been the dream of the planet ever since the end of World War II and the creation of the United Nations. Now, my country, the United States, and I know this because for 20 years I was in a commission on disarmament affairs, conflict resolution, and peace sponsored by the United Nations. the US has intervened, and manipulated the United Nations, but still, the United Nations is the hope. International law is the hope. So I think that if we can, again, grassroots, national pressure, and international pressure, and the international pressure, I believe, probably best could go through the United Nations. And the big issue is the Paros Treaty. If the Paros Treaty, if the United States would stop vetoing the Paros Treaty, there'd be no weapons in space. There would be the vision of space for peace would become a reality. And just one last thing, I mentioned before Craig Eisentroth, who's in a lot of my writings and video on this, and he's a lawyer, he's still alive, thank heavens, in Philadelphia doing good things. And what he told me was that through the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which interestingly enough, he based on the Antarctica Treaty, no weapons in Antarctica. He said, we sought to de-weaponize space before it got weaponized to, these are his words, to keep war out of space. So we have to go back and add to the wonderful, the visionary, the critically important Outer Space Treaty.
Thank you, Karl. Here. Don't forget, if you want to add a question, please go to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and you can add a question in there. We have one from Fiona Mackay, which I think has been addressed by Tamara in the chat list. But did you want to add anything? Anybody want to add anything to that? Her question was, what are some concrete ways that we can expand the peace movement into the very diverse and intersectional issue that we know it to be? For example, how can we connect the expansion of NATO to the struggles of Black and Brown liberation, Indigenous liberation, and queer liberation? Anybody want to add anything to that? Do you want to just summarize your answer, Tamara?
Well, I just want to quickly say that the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and other allies are working closely with organizations like Black Alliance for Peace to create an intersectional movement for peace and justice. And, the struggles of, the Black community, the Indigenous community in Canada are also all struggles. And so we need to support each other. That's really so critical. And then I just shared in the chat a link for a webinar that the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace hosted in July with Black Alliance for Peace and some really amazing Black leaders in Canada. And the title of the webinar is called NATO and US AFRICOM Challenging Militarism's Racism and Violence at Home and Abroad. And I just encourage people to watch it. It's just 1.5 hours, and there's some great information and some great resources and ways that we can connect with each other.
Thank you, Tamara. I can't see any other questions.
Well, Dave, there was a question important from Carol Moore on hypersonic missiles.
Oh, right, yeah.
And this is another enormous threat. I mean, these missiles fly at thousands and thousands miles an hour. Essentially no advanced warning. Judgment can't be used if there would be judgment in these situations. In fact, just a few days ago, Putin very proudly announced the flight of a Russian hypersonic missile. The US is developing these hypersonic missiles. And just to be 30 seconds, we can put the genie back in the bottle. After World War I, the world understood that chemical weapons were horrific and entered into a number of international treaties banning chemical weapons. Not been perfect, there's been use through the years, but basically those treaties have held. I believe we'd have to do the same thing in regard to hypersonic missiles. They're nuclear capable. They're nuclear capable. We must, in my view, work towards banning, making the Earth nuclear free. No nuclear weapons, period. No nuclear power either, because nuclear power plants produce plutonium, and that's how India got the bomb. They produce plutonium. No nuclear power, no nuclear weapons. And there are places on the planet set forth by the United Nations, nuclear-free zones. Again, the whole planet. I think this has to be our goal, to make planet Earth nuclear-free.
Yeah, just actually on that, there is a new campaign which has started up to make Europe a nuclear weapon-free zone. There's a website, I think it's called nukefreeeurope.eu. If you want to join in with that campaign and help to do that. I also wondered, I think Sung-Hee had a 3-minute video she wanted to show. Do you still want to show that, Sung-Hee? Yeah, put your speaker on.
Do you have time? I wonder whether we have time.
We've only got 4 minutes really of scheduled time. Maybe you could send a link to people so people could see it?
Oh, no, it does not have a link. It's,
it does not have a link. Okay.
Yeah. But no, it's okay because if there is more important question or
okay. Yeah. I don't know if we have any more questions, but we are running out of time a bit, and I'd just like to give you all a chance just to have a minute or two to kind of sum up, give an important statement, and then I have an announcement about the some upcoming events of the Global Network. So do you all want to take a chance, take a turn at just kind of a summing up statement? Shall we go back from where we started? So should we start with Bruce and then go backwards?
Well, I just again want to thank people for coming on this webinar, and I want to say how good it is to see our friends from around the world, and to know you're still out there doing that work. You all help me keep going from day in and day out, knowing that you're out there. We're not alone. So I think that's the thing I wanted to say. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Denis, a few final words?
I'd just like to echo what Bruce has said, that it's a great consolation to see all the different actions all around the world, and keep up the work and keep up the pressure. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I've lost the order. Oh, Sung-Hee.
Oh, yes. I want to say I am honored to be invited to this important webinar, and I thank you so much. Then I want to say that I could not really cover the space issue in Japan and Hawaii and other parts of the Pacific. So sorry about that. Please, check yourself, I hope. And then I want to say the militarization of space is going past than we think. And then I find that many of my friends in Jeju, they are really recognizing this important issue. And I think it is thanks to a global network who have worked for a long time. So thank you.
Thank you, Sung-Hee. And your movement in Jeju Island has been an inspiration to so many of us. Your kind of steadfastness and the way that you've behaved in the protests, it's been amazing. So thank you, and please pass our congratulations and thanks on to all your fellow comrades. Thank you. So Tamara.
I would just like to encourage everyone to get involved with the Global Network. The Global Network helped us so much in Canada 17 years ago, keep out of joining American ballistic missile defense, and we'll be forever grateful for that support. And I also want to encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter. It's the @ keep space for peace. Thanks.
Thank you. And Karl.
Yeah, well, just let me say that if space gets weaponized, there's no going back. And consider the consequences of a war in space with these, and ultimately this is what will have to be nuclear energized battle platforms and lasers and hypervelocity guns and particle beams firing at each other and down to earth, and the radioactive debris. I mean, Bruce said it quite correctly. I mean, this would be the war. I mean, it would be an apocalypse. And in our generation, we got to prevent what frankly will inevitably occur if space is allowed to be an arena of war. I mean, it's tragic enough that through the millennia, there's been war after war after war on Earth. Let's stop it at least from being war in space, and then work very hard to stop war on Earth.
Thank you all. And I'd just like to thank also Matt, who's been from Yorkshire CND, who's been kind of doing the technical stuff here. I just wanted to show a couple of slides too. If you would like to get a poster, this is our poster this year for Keep Space for Peace Week. And also a booklet which Karl has authored and is being produced by Beyond Nuclear, the campaign group Beyond Nuclear, on the US Space Force and the dangers of nuclear power. You can download either of these from the Global Network website, spaceforpeace.org, and it's actually also on the Yorkshire CND website. Both of those are on the Yorkshire CND website too. A couple of things to come, coming up in the rest of the Keep Space for Peace Week. On the 10th of October, on Saturday, there will be a webinar from the Memworth Hill Accountability Campaign here in Britain, in Yorkshire. Speakers will include Will Griffin from the Global Network, and also local MPs have been invited, and local activists will be broadcasting from the base or outside the base at Memworth Hill. And the connections between Memworth Hill and Fylingdales, which is a huge missile defense radar in North Yorkshire as well, will be discussed and talked about there. So you can request to join the Zoom meeting. Go to the Memworth Hill Accountability website, and details will be there. Also, a couple of things coming up. The International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility are putting on a webinar on weapons in space, challenges to peace and security. And one of the speakers there is Professor Jürgen Schäffren, and he'll be looking at ways in which we might get through the United Nations, various stepping stones towards banning weapons from space. Again, more details are available on the INIS website, the International Network for Engineers and Scientists, on their website. Also, the Global Network is hosting a panel on a conference called Space Education and Strategic Applications, and that's been organized by the Policy Studies Organization. That's on the 15th of October. We're going to be talking there about campaigning for space, to keep space for peace. We'll have Karl Grossman, Tamara Lawrence, and Aruna Kamila from India, and Bruce Gagnon and myself. And that will be on the 15th of October. So join us if you can. And please join the campaign. Those are the two websites for Yorkshire CND and for Space for the Global Network. So thanks to everyone who's joined us. Thanks again to the speakers for all the work and for all of the things that they do, all the campaigning that's being done around the world. Recognize the importance of this work. It is so important, as has been said over and over. So join us again another time, and thanks again. See you all soon, I hope.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
I won't be able to see it.